So it's my pleasure to welcome Daniel Yergin, the renowned author of The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations, among other books, and Vice Chairman of S&P Global. Dan, thank you very much for making this conversation possible in the context of Rio Oil and Gas conference held last week here in Rio.
Well, thank you, Clarissa. I'm glad to be able to join and be, in effect, part of that Rio Oil and Gas conference, because I know what an important conference that is.
It is, certainly. Dan, we had the benefit of having almost 6,000 people coming and visiting the event and attending the conference over 4 days. So it was amazing. So I like to start the conversation with you, Dan, of course, revisiting the war and the very recent events, but also referring to an interview you gave to a podcast, Intelligence Matters, back in September 2021, where you anticipated that, and I'm quoting, Ukraine is the issue that is going to blow up between Russia and the West. So what are, from your perspective now, what are the implications for energy markets of the current war that most surprise you? And if you could, of course, also comment on the very recent decision taken by OPEC Plus to cut 2 million barrels of oil production.
Right. So let me divide it into two parts. I did in the new map, I wrote in the book that Ukraine was the issue that was going to blow up, because you could see it was coming, because Vladimir Putin didn't recognize Ukraine as a country, and Ukraine, Russia, natural gas in Europe, that was all tied together. And so it was clear that that was the most volatile and dangerous issue. And of course, it's now happened, but it's taken a form that no one, including Vladimir Putin, could possibly have expected. When the Russian troops started to enter Ukraine, they carried ceremonial uniforms for their victory parade in Kiev, and it hasn't turned out that at all. There have been a whole host of miscalculations, and now it's more than half a year, and the war goes on. It's changed the energy markets. It's changed the flow of energy markets. Russia is in the process of losing its most important market for its oil and gas, which is Europe. That oil will flow to other countries, and it is flowing to India and China and so forth. Gas is going to be harder for Russia to reposition. Meanwhile, there's basically a gas war, a second front in the Ukraine war taking place in the European gas market, where Russia is disrupting supply in order to create, as Putin said, economic hardship and social turmoil, change governments. So far, it hasn't happened, but it can be a very difficult winter ahead, especially if it's a cold winter. And we're seeing prices of natural gas at levels that no one could have possibly imagined. And by the way, that goes for coal too, because the price of coal is 3 or 4 times higher than normal, and the price of gas in Europe is 10 times higher. I think that what comes out of this is a reshaping of the global energy markets and global energy flows, that Russian oil will flow not to Europe, but to other parts of the world. So the supply chains are being shifted around. I think gas, as I say, is going to be more disruptive. And very shortly, we're going to see the European ban on importing Russian crude oil by ship, and at the same time forbidding shipping and insurance services, and the struggle to put a price cap on oil that the United States is leading. So I think the next couple of months are going to be a lot of turmoil and turbulence in the world oil market as this progresses.
And does this recent decision taken by OPEC add to this volatility?
Yes, the recent decision by OPEC, I think, came really as a surprise to Europe and the United States, because they remember President Biden went 3 months ago to Saudi Arabia. There were other things on his agenda, like Iran and stability in the region, but oil was on his on this concern. And this now is a surprising, now it's said to be a 2 million barrel a day cut. It's actually 1 million barrels a day because of some of the countries just don't have the capacity in any event to produce. But, and it goes into effect in November. Reaction in Washington has been really sort of shock because the Democratic administration, the Democrats see it as trying to influence the U.S. election through gasoline prices. That's their perception. And it seems to be an embarrassment for President Biden, certainly. He said he's disappointed, but I'm sure the reaction is stronger. And it does tie back to the larger question of this kind of disruption that's coming in the next 2 months and how Russia will respond to efforts to put a price cap on its oil. Will it hold back on production? So this is an economic matter because, of course, the Gulf countries were looking and saying, look at the Federal Reserve, other central banks are raising interest rates. There's going to be a recession. Demand's going to go down. So let's be prepared for it to go down. Although it could go up if China comes out of its COVID lockdown, but it's also being seen, particularly in Europe and the United States, as very political. So it's controversial, but I think it's part of this larger drama of what happens with the ban on Russian crude oil and the effort to keep it flowing to the rest of the world and not have an oil shock, a big oil shortage.
So very interesting to have your perception, your take on this very recent event, and thank you for adding this to our conversation. I want to go back to the role of the U.S. in the current crisis. Very recently, you mentioned that the world will be in a much worse position during the energy crisis if it wasn't for shale gas. And you said that during a conversation at the podcast for the IMF. So do you believe that there is still an increased role for the U.S. as a global producer of energy, with seeing increased exports of LNG, for instance, even in an era of diminished reliance on global trade?
Well, I think you raised two parts to it, because I think, as you say, in general, in global trade, we're seeing not the end of globalization, but a fragmentation of globalization, regionalization coming, and that kind of the supply chains of this era of what I call the WTO, the World Trade Organization era of just supply chains based upon efficiency is over. And now politics are much more involved in this new era of great power competition. With that said, absolutely, the United States is the world's largest producer of oil, largest producer of natural gas. That would not have been imagined 15 years ago. And it is the shale revolution. And I think we see the geopolitical significance of it. You know, people didn't realize that the United States was becoming the world's largest exporter of LNG, and it only started in 2016, so it's very new. And what I can see is that Europe now regards U.S. LNG, along with LNG in general, but particularly U.S. LNG, as a foundation of its energy security, and a significant, not total, but a significant replacement for Russian natural gas, which it says it does not intend to buy anymore. Mm-hmm. And by the way, if I say that, I mean, what's happened, you know, Putin with the invasion has shattered 22 years of economic integration of Russia with the world. And for 50 years, Russia, and before that, the Soviet Union, had this message: we are a reliable supplier. Forget politics. Whatever happens in politics, you can count on us. That's over.
Yes, so some experts say that he is undermining the mid and long-term economic survival of its own country, of his own country.
I think it's true. I mean, the nature of the sanctions, and it's not just the sanctions, it's a breakdown of trade. And I think the result of this is something that I wrote about in the new map, that Russia will increasingly become economically dependent on China. Mm-hmm. But I think China now has to be looking at Russia and a little worried about the competence of its leadership to have made this big a mistake and now be threatening nuclear war.
Mm-hmm. And given the recent response by some countries such as Germany, for instance, or Spain, France, you know, European is acting as a bloc, but is also some governments are also taking I would say, individual perspective to the crisis. In this context, can we avoid what is being called a Wild West scenario, as mentioned by Fatih Birol a couple of days ago?
I think so. I think that the basis of cooperation is so clear. Governments will do things like Germany. I mean, what governments are looking at is their consumers looking at prices that are so much higher than they've ever had to pay. And so they're putting in subsidies of one kind or another, and other countries are looking at that and say, there's a kind of competition going on. But I think all the governments are in the same position, that they need to protect their economy. And so you're having a lot of government intervention now to deal with this. And part of it is because they didn't pay attention to energy security before this crisis.
Mm-hmm. And so shifting from energy security to energy transition, maybe then something that is very clear for now is that this energy crisis illustrates the extent to which we'll still depend on fossil fuel, 80%. And then the energy transition will be both bumpy and costly, much more than initially expected. So what could still be done to accelerate in a secure and reliable and predictable way the energy transition?
Well,
should we rely more on public policies?
Well, I think public policies are pretty heavy. If you look at what the United States has just passed with its so-called Inflation Reduction Act, that's pouring, a lot of money very easily available to people into the economy. So I think that, the push towards renewables continues. But I think what you said, this is going to be bumpy. The notion, one of the things that when I was writing the new map, I got really curious about energy transition because everybody talks about it. And you realize this energy transition is totally different from any other energy transition that we've ever gone through, which unfolded over a century, and it was really energy addition. Here you're talking in a quarter of a century, changing the foundations of what today is a $90 trillion roughly world economy. And it's never been done. And as you point out, people forget the world is slightly over 80% dependent on hydrocarbons today. So I think that there are big issues there. There's a north-south divide. There's the question about the minerals. I mean, one of the things very interesting is mining. I say in the book that you'll go from big oil to big shovels because you'll need so much more mining. There's the question of kind of the macroeconomic impacts, really understanding it, and then there's actually that question of energy security, the realization that we've had a period of preemptive underinvestment, anticipatory underinvestment in conventional energy on the premise that the new sources are there, and that's created a gap. People forget or don't recognize this energy crisis did not begin with the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th. It began around September of 2021 when the markets really tightened because demand was coming back after COVID. And there had been insufficient investment in developing new supplies. So I think that one of the messages is you're not going to have an energy transition unless you have energy security. And that means that you have to continue investing in your conventional resources, even as you make that transition, because otherwise you're going to get crises and you're going to get backlash, and it's going to be a lot more difficult.
This is a very interesting aspect that you're bringing to the table, Dan. And what's the role in this context of demand side measures? Should we go for more energy efficiency, for more technologies that would really change the behavior of the demand for energy?
Well, I actually got into the whole energy field as focused on demand and conservation and efficiency. And I think it's often been underestimated, its impact. So, if we had not become a more energy efficient world, the demand supply would be just an enormous problem. So I think, the thing about energy efficiency, it doesn't have the drama of a beautiful wind turbine or shining solar panels, but it's really I called it in my other book, The Quest, the fifth energy source. So I think it's a very important part of it, and it really involves a lot of it involves technological innovation, and I think that will happen, and it happens in response to high prices.
So I'll follow up on your technological piece. You mentioned very recently as well that one takeaway from both shale and solar is that innovation can take decades to reach the breakthrough point where its full impact becomes clear. Where do you believe that now we should look for the most disruptive technologies in this energy transition scenario?
Well, to some degree, Clarissa, it will be what we don't see. But right now, but it is, now as you ask your question, I think about it, that basically solar and shale both took 2 to 3 decades to move from idea to become incredibly competitive. And we've had a shale revolution and we've had a solar revolution, although those costs are perhaps going up again. But there are a couple of areas that are important that actually don't get as much attention. One is carbon capture. Another, of course, the really hot subject now that was not on the agenda 3 years ago is hydrogen. Mm-hmm. Everybody's working on hydrogen, it seems now. And the EU, even before this crisis, was saying 25% of their total energy by 2050 could come from hydrogen. I think it's still probably going to be 2 or 3 years to demonstrate that you can get to scale in hydrogen, because obviously hydrogen's a business now. It's just not an energy business. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one. And then, I think battery storage is the other, key thing to get to scale in battery storage, so that wind and solar are no longer intermittent but can be stored. So I think those are some of the areas. I think there's very interesting work being done on kind of the biological side of energy, for instance, plants that will store carbon better. So I think those are kind of the agenda. But I'll tell you, hydrogen's come from almost nowhere now to be front and center as a focus of investment and activity around the world, everywhere you go.
Yeah. Even here in Brazil, then we are positioning ourselves as possible exporters of green hydrogen through ammonia or any other or embedded into steel, cement, other energy intense materials. As our conversation is coming to an end, then I would like to have the opportunity to have your perspective about Brazil. As you know, we are a very resource-rich country when it comes to energy resources. And what should be our priorities? Should we aim to be more influential in the new energy order?
Well, I think Brazil very much has the potential, because of its energy resources and because of its scale and size as a country and its importance, to be more influential and to bring balance to the discussion. I think this problem of a north-south divide is not well understood in the North, that the South has high priority on economic development, on reducing poverty, on improving health, and those are priorities there. And I think, there's a very interesting case with Uganda, where the European Parliament came out against a pipeline being built in Uganda and Tanzania. And the European Parliament's in France, where the per capita income is almost 25 times higher than Uganda. So I think Brazil is in the middle ground, obviously. And of course, its offshore industry is at the forefront in terms of technology. And I think that Brazil, as a reliable, stable, growing producer, can play a very important role. And I think the lesson is that investment is going to be it's going to be competitive to bring in investment. And so creating an investment regime, maintaining an investment regime that brings in investment, that has stability, that has predictability, will mean that Brazil's role will grow in the world. And most importantly, over time, Brazil will benefit from the revenues that are generated, from the wealth that's generated. But the best way to do that is not with a kind of stop and go and avoiding some of the battles you're seeing elsewhere in Latin America, but showing itself that it is a stable leader in Latin America and one of the stable and important leaders in world energy. And that will be a great contribution for Brazil and for the world.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan, for ending our conversation on this positive note. It was really a pleasure to meet you again and to be able to share some thoughts about the future of energy.
Well, thank you. And I was very pleased to be able to join you, Clarissa, and continue the dialogue from the Rio Oil and Gas conference. So thank you. And greetings
Thank
to
you,
everyone.
and see you in Sierra Week next year.
Sierra Week 2023. Be there. Exactly. I'm glad you have your mug. Thank you.
I do.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.